The war was long and dark, and full of fire and screams and broken homes and broken hearts, and when it ended, there was silence. A heavy silence that did not feel like peace, and the soldiers stood tired and empty, and waiting for something, anything, to feel alive again, and Commander Rian stood among them, tall and strong, but his eyes held the weight of everything he had seen. They gave him a medal, a shining piece of metal that meant nothing to him, and they gave him a title that sounded like glory but felt like guilt, and then they gave him something else, something he never asked for, something wrapped in chains. She was small and thin, and shaking her skin was a soft blue, her eyes large and silver like moons, and her wrists were locked in cuffs that rattled when she moved, and she did not speak, she did not cry, she just stared at the floor like she had done it 1,000 times before. The alien warlord smiled with teeth too sharp and too white and said, "This is your reward for bravery. This girl is yours. She was taken from a traitor clan and belongs to you now. Do with her as you wish." And Rian looked at the girl and then looked at the warlord and said nothing because his throat was tight and his heart was louder than his thoughts. Others clapped and laughed and toasted to victory, but Rian stepped forward slowly and knelt in front of the girl, and she flinched like she expected pain, and he reached out gently and touched the chain, and it was cold and cruel, and he hated it. And then he looked into her eyes and said, "You are not mine." She blinked once, and then again, and then her lips moved, but no sound came out, and Rian stood and lifted her up in his arms, and she did not fight, she did not understand, and the room fell quiet as he walked away, carrying her past the doors, past the guards, past the warlord, who did not stop him, and into the quiet of the night. Wind was soft, and the stars were bright, and the road was long and empty, and Rian walked without speaking. And the girl lay still in his arms like a shadow, like a ghost, and he could feel how light she was, how broken and hollow, and he knew this was not victory, this was not justice, this was just another wound. He brought her to his quarters, a quiet place on the edge of the city, far from noise, far from war, and he placed her on the soft couch and brought warm water and cut the chains with tools from the shed, and each link fell to the floor with a heavy sound like a door closing. She sat there, staring at the broken cuffs on the ground, and then looked at her wrists and touched them slowly, like she was not sure they were real. And Rian said, "You are free here. I will not hurt you, I will not command you." And she looked at him with wide eyes, full of confusion, full of fear, and full of something he could not name. He gave her a blanket and food and a quiet room, and said, "You can sleep or walk or leave. I will not stop you." And she did not answer. She just held the blanket close and sat on the floor near the wall and watched him from the corner like he was fire, and she was ash. That night he did not sleep. He sat on the chair near the door and listened to the silence and wondered what kind of world gave chained girls to soldiers and called it honor, and what kind of men accepted it, and how many never said no and never said anyone free. Morning came slow and golden, and Rian opened his eyes and saw her still in the corner, still holding the blanket, still awake, and he said, "Good morning." But she did not speak, and he smiled a little and said, "Maybe tomorrow," and made breakfast for two and left a plate near her. She touched the food like it might vanish, like it might bite her, and then ate in small bites like every bite might be her last. And Rian watched without staring and gave her space and time, and silence. Days passed like this, slow and quiet and heavy, and she said nothing and he asked nothing, and every day he left her food, and every night he sat in the chair and waited for a sign for anything. Then one night he heard a sound soft and broken, and turned to see her looking at him, eyes full of water and lips trembling, and she whispered one word. Rian felt his heart freeze and then melt, and he said, "Because no one deserves to live in chains." And for the first time her eyes met his without fear, and something changed, something small, something bright. The gift no one wanted had spoken, and the man who never asked for her had listened. On the story was just beginning. Sky outside turned dark as the wind whispered softly through the trees and inside the small room. Rian sat quietly near the fire while the alien girl curled up in the far corner with the blanket, wrapped tightly around her thin frame, and her eyes stayed open, watching everything without blinking, and she had not spoken again since that one word, why, and Rian did not push her because he knew trust was like a seed it needed time to grow, and water to live. He brought her food every day and placed it gently near her without saying much, and he kept his distance so she would feel safe, and never once did he lock the door or raise his voice. And sometimes he would sit outside under the stars and talk to the night, telling stories of his home, his family, his memories, and he did not know if she was listening, but he hoped something inside her heard his voice and knew it was kind one. Evening, she stood up slowly and walked toward the door, and Rian watched her, but said nothing, and she opened it and looked out at the quiet world, and for a long moment she did not move, and then she stepped outside, barefoot, into the cold grass, and stood there breathing the fresh air like it was the first clean breath in years. Rian followed her, but not too close, and he watched her from a few steps away, and she turned to him with fear in her eyes, like she expected to be punished or dragged back, and he shook his head slowly and pointed to the stars and said, "You can go if you want, I will not stop. You and I will not chase you." And her eyes widened, and she looked at him like he was something she had never seen before, something impossible. She stayed out there until the moon was high, then returned inside and sat back in the corner without a word. But something had changed, something small, something silent but strong, and the next morning she took the plate from his hand without hesitation and ate sitting near the fire instead of the wall, and though she still said nothing, her eyes no longer looked like broken glass. Days passed, and she began to move more freely around the house, and once Rian saw her looking at the bookshelf, her fingers brushing the spines of old books, and she paused at one with drawings and turned the pages slowly, and he said, "You can keep it," and she took it without a sound and brought it to her corner and stared at it for hours. That night, he left a cup of warm tea near her and sat by the window watching the stars, and he spoke again softly, telling her about the world outside, about how some people had hearts made of stone and others had hearts full of light, and he said he believed she had a heart that remembered both pain and hope, and maybe one day she would believe it too. The next morning, something strange happened. She moved to the table where he was eating and sat across from him, and though she did not speak, she did not look away, and she took the bread he offered and ate it slowly, and Rian smiled and said, "Good morning," and she looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once, very small but very real. He wanted to ask her name, but held the question inside, afraid to break the fragile moment, and instead he said, "My name is Rian," and then he waited, and she said nothing. But her lips moved like she was testing the shape of his name, and later when he was cleaning the dishes, he thought he heard her whisper it under her breath. So soft he almost believed he imagined it. That night, she did not sleep in the corner. She moved her blanket closer to the fire and curled up near where he sat reading, and though she did not speak, her presence was louder than any words, and Rian felt something warm inside him, something that had been cold for a long time, and he knew this was not just healing, it was the beginning of something neither of them could name yet. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire burned low, she pointed to the sky through the window and said, "Home," and Rian turned to her with wide eyes, and she pointed again and said, "Stars, home, family," and then she looked down and her voice trembled, and she said, "All gone," and he moved closer slowly and said, "I am sorry," and she nodded, but tears filled her eyes, and he knew she had lost more than he could ever understand. She stood up and walked to him and placed her hand gently on his chest and whispered, "Thank you." And it was the first time he saw her smile, not with her lips, but with her eyes, and he smiled back, not with joy, but with Understanding and respect, and something else deeper than words, she still refused to speak much, but when she did, every word mattered and word mattered, and we never asked for more because what she gave was already everything. The sun had not yet risen, and the world was still wrapped in silence. When she opened the door with slow hands and careful steps, and the cold wind touched her face, like a whisper calling her to run and not look back, and her feet stepped onto the wet grass without making a sound, and her heart pounded louder than her breath, and her eyes darted around like a frightened animal searching for an exit from a cage that never fully opened. She looked back once at the small wooden house with a warm orange glow from the fire dancing in the window, and she saw Rian sitting in his chair with his eyes closed. Not sleeping, but resting, and she knew he would hear the door and come after her, but when she turned again and walked into the trees, no footsteps followed, and no voice called her name, and no hands grabbed her arm to drag her back. Forest was thick and dark and full of strange sounds, and she walked faster, trying to push her fear deep inside where it could not stop her, but every crack of a twig made her flinch, and every rustle of leaves felt like danger, and her bare feet stung from the sharp rocks and frozen earth, and still she kept going because freedom was a dream worth bleeding 4 hours past, or maybe minutes. She could not tell, and her body grew tired, and her legs ached, and her breath came out in broken pieces, and then she heard them, not footsteps, not Rian, but low growls, echoing from behind the thick trees, and her blood turned to ice. 4 creatures stepped into the clearing, their eyes glowing yellow, and their teeth long and sharp, and their bodies low to the ground like predators ready to strike, and she froze, unable to scream or move, and the memory of other chains and other monsters rose like smoke in her mind, and she fell to her knees with her arms over her head, waiting for pain, but the pain never came, only a roar, not from the creatures, but from behind her, and a flash of light, as something shot through the air and hit one of the beasts, and the others turned and growled louder, but another blast came, and another, and she dared to lift her eyes and saw Rian standing tall with a strange weapon in his hand, and his face fierce like a storm, ready to break. The creatures ran into the shadows and vanished, and Rian dropped the weapon and rushed to her side and knelt beside her. And his voice was calm but shaking as he said, "Are you hurt?" And she stared at him with wide eyes, full of questions, full of guilt, and full of something else she did not understand. He did not scold her, and he did not ask why she ran. He only took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders and lifted her gently into his arms and carried her back through the woods and the cold and the fog, and her tears came without warning because she had thought he would punish her or chain her or leave her to die, but he had come to save her. Even after she ran inside the house, he lit the fire and brought warm water and dried her feet and wrapped him in cloth, and placed her near the fire, and sat close enough to watch her, but not close enough to scare her, and she whispered, "I am sorry," and he shook his head, and said, "You do not owe me anything that night." She did not return to the corner. She curled up on the rug near the fire, and when he handed her a cup of tea, she took it with both hands, and sipped slowly, and for the first time since she arrived, she leaned against the wall, and closed her eyes, and slept, without fear. Next day she followed him outside to the garden, where he grew herbs and simple vegetables, and she helped him pull weeds with her small hands, and though they did not speak much, their silence was soft, not heavy, and sometimes she would glance at him and catch him smiling, and she would look away. With a quiet smile of her own later, she sat on the porch and watched the trees sway in the wind. And she said softly, "I wanted to see if you meant it." And Rian looked up from the wooden bench where he was cleaning his tools and asked, "Meant what?" And she said, "When you said I was free." And he nodded slowly and said, "I meant every word, and I still do, and always will." She stood and walked toward him and placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you, not for chasing me, but for not needing to." And he looked at her with eyes full of light and said, "You came back because you wanted to, not because I made you, and that means more than any chain ever could." The sky turned orange as the sun dipped behind the trees, and they stood there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing the same air and watching the same horizon. And in that quiet moment, something invisible and strong formed between them, not made of chains or rules or fear, but something new, something real, something like trust. The days grew warmer, and the trees whispered with life, and every morning began with quiet steps and gentle sunlight spilling across the floor of the little house, where Rian now left the front door open, not because he expected her to run, but because he trusted she would stay. And every evening ended with soft embers in the fireplace and 2 cups placed side by side, one often untouched but never removed, and always waiting just in case she felt ready. She had stopped hiding in the corners, and now sat near the fire during the long evenings while Rian read stories from old books with torn pages and worn covers, and though she did not speak much, she listened, her eyes following every movement, every sound, and sometimes when he paused, she would tilt her head just slightly, like she wanted to ask what happened next, but could not find the courage to say it aloud. One morning, she followed him outside without a word and helped him carry water from the stream, and though the buckets were heavy, she did not complain. And when Rian offered to take both, she shook her head and carried hers all the way back, and when they reached the door, she looked at him and said, "Not weak," and he smiled and nodded and replied, "Never thought you were," and her eyes softened with something close to pride. Later, she stood at the edge of the garden, watching a group of butterflies dance above the flowers, and she reached out as one passed near her hand, and she turned to Rian and said, "On my planet we had creatures like these. They glowed in the dark and sang at night." And then she looked away quickly, like she had said too much, and Rian simply said, "I would like to see them one day, if you ever want to show me." And she blinked slowly and whispered, "Maybe." That night, a storm rolled over the hills, and rain beat against the roof like drums in the sky, and thunder cracked across the mountains, and she ran from her room and stood in the hallway with wide eyes and shaking hands, and Rian stood calmly near the fire and said, "It is just the sky making noise," and she stared at the ceiling like it might fall, and whispered too loud, and he offered her his coat and said, "Sit with me, it will pass," and she did. They sat near the flames, her body wrapped in the heavy coat, and her eyes watching the flickering light, and Rian began to hum a melody soft and low, something his mother used to sing when he was a child, and after a while, she leaned her head back and closed her eyes and began to hum along with him, not the same tune, but one of her own, something from her world, and together the 2 sounds twisted and danced like threads in the wind. And Rian said, "That is beautiful," and she replied, "My mother sang it too when I could not sleep." The fire crackled and the thunder moved far away, and she looked at him and said, "Your world is loud but not cruel." And he said, "Sometimes it is both, but I try to be quiet and kind." And she nodded and said, "You are not like others." And he answered, "Maybe I never wanted to be." And then she laughed, not loudly, but softly, like a whisper wrapped in light, and for the first time she smiled. It was not a big smile. It did not show her teeth or stretch wide across her face, but it lived in her eyes, and the curve of her lips, and the tilt of her head. And it lit the room more than the fire ever could, and Rian saw it and felt something inside him shift, like a lock being turned or a door being opened for the first time. In a long time, he did not say anything, afraid the moment might break, and she did not explain why she smiled, but something passed between them, something old and new, something fragile and powerful, and they both knew without words that something had begun. The next day, she placed her hand over his on the table during breakfast and said, "Thank you for the storm," and he laughed a little and said, "It scared you," and she replied, "It brought a song back to me, and that is worth being scared." And he did not try to understand everything, because he knew sometimes the heart speaks in ways the mind cannot follow. That afternoon, she helped him fix the broken fence and laughed again when he dropped a hammer on his foot, and when he cursed under his breath, she tried to repeat the word and ended up saying something completely wrong. And they both laughed until their sides hurt and the forest around them echoed with joy that had not been heard in years. She no longer walked like a shadow. She moved with purpose and grace, and when she touched the plants or the water or the air, it felt like she was learning the world all over again. And when Rian looked at her, he did not see a slave or a gift or a stranger. He saw a soul awakening, and he felt honored to witness it. The sun set behind the hills that evening, painting the sky in gold and fire. And she stood at the porch, wrapped in the same old coat, and turned to Rian and said, "Do you think stars can hear us?" And he looked up and said, "Maybe." And she whispered, "Then I will sing to them, and maybe they will sing back." And with that she smiled again, brighter and fuller. And this time, Rian smiled too, and together they listened to the stars, even if they did not sing back. The wind changed before the sky did, and the birds flew low as if warning of something coming, and Rian felt it in his bones, though he could not name it. And the girl, who now stood without fear and smiled without shame, seemed not to notice the heaviness in the air, and she was painting that morning with colors. She mixed herself from flowers and leaves, and her fingers moved with joy like they belonged to a different world. She had drawn the stream and the trees and the butterflies and even the outline of Rian's boots as he stood near her, watching with a quiet smile. And she looked up and laughed and said, "You move too much. I cannot finish your shape." And he said, "Maybe I like to be mysterious." And she rolled her eyes and stuck her tongue out. Just for a second, but long enough to make him laugh harder than he had in weeks. Then the ground began to hum a low sound that grew like thunder trapped beneath the soil, and the trees swayed as if something unseen passed between them. And Rian stood straighter and looked to the sky and saw the clouds part as a silver ship descended without sound, but full of purpose, and fear began to grow in his chest like a cold wave ready to crash. She turned to see what he was staring at, and the brush fell from her hand as her eyes widened and her breath stopped, and she whispered, "They found me." And her voice was not angry or happy, but full of something deep and tangled, something that even she could not explain. The ship landed just beyond the edge of the forest, and from it came tall figures cloaked in deep green and marked with silver lines across their faces, and they walked without noise and without weapons, but their eyes spoke of power and judgment. And they looked first at Rian, then at her, and then back again, as if deciding something heavy. And final one of them stepped forward, a woman taller than most, and with eyes like frozen stars, and she said in a language Rian did not understand, but the girl did, and she flinched, as if struck, and then stood up straight and replied in the same tongue. Her words sharp and fast and full of fire and sorrow, and the tall woman narrowed her eyes and spoke again, slower this time, and softer. Rian stepped between them and said, "She is free." And the tall woman raised one eyebrow and answered in broken human speech, "She is ours." And he said, "Not anymore." And she said, "You do not understand her value, her bloodline, her bond." And he said, "I do not care what you see. I see a person, not a possession. And I will not let you take her." The girl moved past him and stood between them, her hands open and empty, and her voice calm but strong. And she said, "I choose to stay with him. I am not your tool, not your daughter, not your voice. I am my own, and I have found peace here." And the tall woman said, "You betray your blood." And the girl said, "I follow my heart." There was silence so deep it swallowed the wind, and the tall woman looked into her eyes for a long time, then turned to the others and spoke words that echoed like bells through the trees, and they all bowed slightly, then stepped back one by one and returned to the ship, except the tall woman, who remained and said to Heian, "If you break her, we will come back, and there will be no words, only war." And he nodded and said, "Then I will never break her." The ship rose into the sky and vanished into the clouds, and the hum faded, and the trees were still again, and the girl collapsed to her knees, shaking not from fear, but from release, and Rian knelt beside her and wrapped his arms around her and whispered, "You are safe." And she whispered back, "I never thought they would leave me." And he said they did, because you stood tall. And she said, "I stood tall because you taught me how." Later that night they sat by the fire, neither speaking for a long time, and she held his hand without hesitation, and he looked at her and said, "I thought I would lose you today." And she said, "I was already lost before I met you, and now I have been found." And Rian felt something rise in his chest, something too large to name and too gentle, too fierce. She leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes and said, "I have no home but this one, no name but what you call me, and no path but the one we walk together." And Rian kissed the top of her head and said, "Then let us build a life where no one ever chains you again." The stars above seemed brighter that night, and the wind softer, and even the trees swayed as if in song, and the world felt less broken. Because two people had chosen each other not by duty or reward, but by something far deeper, something called love. The days turned golden and soft, as if the world itself had paused to let their hearts breathe, and Rian no longer counted time by sunrises or sunsets, but by the sound of her laughter and the warmth of her smile. And she no longer walked with fear, but with light steps that seemed to dance even when she carried buckets or pulled weeds or cleaned the old house that now felt like theirs. Not his. Each morning he made her tea, and each night she made him stories, strange tales from her world that he could not always understand but listened to anyway. Because her voice carried colors he had never seen, and her eyes told truths even when her words did not, and sometimes they would sit together without speaking, and those quiet moments felt louder than any storm or battle he had ever known. One evening after the sun had gone and the stars filled the sky with soft, silver light, Rian stood by the window holding something small in his hand, something round and smooth and bright, and he looked at it like it held both fear and hope. And she watched him from the couch, with her head tilted and her fingers playing with the end of her scarf, and she said, "What is that?" And he turned to her slowly and said something I have kept for a long time but never dared to give. She stood and walked to him and took the object gently from his palm and turned it over in her hand and saw the way it caught the light and shimmered like stardust, and she looked up at him with wide eyes full of questions and wonder. And he said, "It is not a chain, and it is not a gift, and it is not a reward. It is a question, and the answer is only yours." She held the ring close to her heart and whispered, "What do you ask?" And he knelt down on one knee, not as a soldier, not as a savior, but as a man who had learned to love. And he looked into her eyes and said, "Will you be my wife, not because I saved you, or because you owe me anything, but because I cannot imagine a future where I do not wake up beside you?" And she covered her mouth with her hands as tears filled her eyes, and for a moment she said nothing, and then she dropped to her knees. "2 and S." And whispered yes. He slipped the ring on her finger, and it was too big, and it spun once before resting, but she smiled like it was perfect, and he said, "I will find one that fits." And she said, "It fits my heart, and that is enough." And they laughed and cried and held each other until the fire burned low and the stars began to fade. Next day they began to prepare, not a grand wedding, not a loud one, but a quiet promise under the open sky, where they first shared stories and pain and healing. And she gathered wildflowers for her hair, and he carved simple bands from soft wood, and they invited no one but the trees and the birds and the wind. They had always carried their secrets. She stood in front of him, barefoot in the grass, wearing a dress made from old fabric stitched with love and symbols from her culture and his. And he wore his old uniform, not for pride, but for memory. And he had stitched a piece of her scarf into the inside of his jacket near his heart, and they held hands and spoke words not from tradition but from truth. She said, "I was born into chains, but you taught me how to break them, not with fire, but with patience and kindness, and every step you took toward me showed me how to take one toward myself, and I give You my days not as a debt, but as a gift, and Rian said I was born into war. And you taught me peace, not with silence, but with your courage, and every word you spoke lit a candle in the dark. Parts of me, and I give you my tomorrows, because they are only worth living with youth. They kissed under the sky with no music but the wind, and no witness but the trees, and no need for more. Because what they had was already whole and strong and true. And when they walked back to the house, hand in hand, it was not as rescuer and rescued, or as human and alien, but as two souls who had found a home in each other. Night, they lit every candle in the house, and danced to the sound of her voice singing and his laughter echoing, and for the first time in years Rian dreamed not of battles or loss, but of fields full of light and a future where every step was taken. Beside her outside, the stars blinked softly as if watching over them, and inside the house, the fire burned bright and steady like the life they had just promised to build, one moment at a time, one breath after another, always together. The morning light poured into the house like a golden river, and the air smelled of wildflowers and bread and warmth, and the girl who once shook under heavy chains now moved with soft strength through the rooms she helped build, and every wall whispered their story, not with paint or pictures, but with peace. And Rian watched her from the garden, where he trimmed herbs and cleaned tools, and thought about how strange it was to feel complete after so many years of being broken. She stepped outside barefoot, holding a basket filled with berries and herbs, and smiled at him with that same smile that once bloomed like a secret, but now lived freely on her face every day. And he wiped his hands on a cloth and took the basket and said, "These will taste better because you picked them." And she laughed and said, "Maybe because I sang to them while picking." And he said then, "I hope the berries learned your song." Their days were filled with small joys like that, quiet moments that echoed louder than all the battles Rian had fought. And she taught him the names of stars in her language, and he showed her how to mend boots and sharpen tools, and together they made things stronger, not just objects, but memories and love. And one day, she found an old mirror in the storage room and looked at herself for a long time, and when Rian found her there, she said softly, "I no longer see a prisoner, I see a person." News of their bond began to spread through nearby settlements, and traders brought stories of a human and an alien girl who lived together in harmony, and some came out of curiosity, and others with questions, and a few with judgment, but none left unchanged, 'cause they saw something in the way she touched his shoulder, and the way he looked at her, as if she were both sky and earth, and fire and water, all in one breath. Then came the day when a young alien girl knocked at their door, her clothes torn, and her eyes hollow, and her voice a whisper. She said, "They gave me away to a man who hurt me, and I ran, and I heard about you, and I thought maybe you would understand." And before Rian could speak, the woman who once was chained took the girl's hand and brought her inside, and said, "You are safe now, no one will hurt you." Here they gave the girl food and blankets and time, and never asked her to explain, until one night, she sat near the fire and began to cry, and then she spoke, and then she slept. And in the days that followed, she learned to plant and cook and laugh, and she called the woman sister and called Rian uncle, and the house became not just a home, but a place where healing lived. More came after that, one by one, and sometimes in pairs, broken souls who had been passed around as trophies or tools, and they arrived with wounds visible and invisible, and they stayed because what they found was not a leader or a healer, but a woman who had lived their pain and still found a way to smile again. Rian built more rooms, and she taught the others how to sing, and when they ran out of space, they built more homes together, and soon a village began to rise from the soil made not of stone, but of choice and courage. And every door opened without locks, and every table held room for one more. And when someone asked what this place was called, she looked at Rian, and he looked at her, and together they said, "Freedom." Years passed, and children ran through the fields, and elders told stories of the girl who once had no name, and the man who gave her none because he wanted her to choose, and she did. And when people asked about her past, she would show them the broken chain she kept in a box. Not as a memory of pain, but as proof of how far she had come, and when they asked what saved her, she would say, not kindness, not luck, but the space to choose. One evening as the sun fell and the stars took their place, she sat with Rian on the old porch and watched the lights in the distance from homes they had built and people they had helped, and she said, do you think we changed anything? And he said, I think you changed everything. And she leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, I think we became the story others needed to hear. And he said, and we are still writing it one day at a time. The wind carried the scent of peace, and the trees whispered lullabies, and somewhere in the village a child laughed, and another sang, and a fire crackled. And in the center of it all sat the woman who had once been silent and afraid, now strong and soft and loved, and free, not because someone saved her, but because someone gave her the power to save herself.